There exist plenty of complex and powerful tools like Postman for testing out a REST API, but did you know that on your Linux system right now, you already have a tool installed to do that, and that tool is curl. Now, if you happen to stumble across this video and you don't know what a REST API is, basically it's an architecture style for sending data to and from a server. Now, the way it's done is through regular HTTP methods. Now, the reason why this is so great is because neither on the client or the server do you have to install any extra libraries to get all of this working, because all you have to be able to do is make a basic web request, and if you can do that, well, you can use a REST API. Now, if you want a bit more of a complex description of it, this website does a pretty good job of it. Now, on this image here, it shows that it uses JSON, but you don't have to use JSON. You can use things like XML or YAML. Typically, though, in a lot of web systems, you're just going to be using JSON just because that's kind of the de facto standard now. And because we're testing a REST API today, we obviously need a REST API to test. And to do that, I'm going to be using a service called JSON Placeholder. This is free to use, so if you want to follow along with me, then feel free to do that. Basically, it's a fake online REST API for testing and prototyping. So I could have spun something up myself, but this is a much quicker way to do this. Now, basically what it means by fake is it'll accept your API request, but it's not going to modify anything on the server, just because that could be a bit of a problem for other users testing with this. And luckily for us, the developer decided to include a guide on how to do all of the API requests in JavaScript. Now, this is being done through the Fetch API, so what we're going to be doing is taking all of these API requests in here, maybe not all of them, we'll see if we get through all of them, and then converting them over to work with curl. Now, obviously you might see at this point, well, couldn't you just write a basic JavaScript project and test it like that? Well, yeah, you could. That's another way you could test it. You could also test it with Postman or a bunch of other tools like that. But today, we're going to look at how to do it with curl instead. Now, to get this to work, there are two options we need to use in curl. So let's just bring up the man page for curl and see what those are. So man curl, and as you'll see, the curl man page, it's quite long. I guess it's not going to show the total line count. I think it's about 3,000 lines long, so there's a lot of stuff that this program can do, and we're not going to be touching on most of it. There are just two options we need to look at today, and then I'll mention a couple others towards the end. Now, the first one we need is the -- request option. So this option right here, so a bit further down, this one right here. Basically, this will let you specify which HTTP method you want to use. So this one right here will be very important to what we're doing today. Now, by default, curl does a GET request. And the other one we're going to need is the -- data option. And this one right here, so where is it? -- data. This one right here. So -- data is used to put data into your HTTP request. Now, there are other forms you can use. There's like a data URL encode, data raw, data binary, or data ASCII. Data ASCII is the same as -- data, but if you need to send binary data or raw data, or you need to do some URL encoding, these options are also here for you as well, but we're not going to be touching those today. Now that we understand the curl options we need, let's test out these API endpoints. Now, this first one in here is dead simple. You've done this plenty of times. If you've ever used curl before, you know exactly what we're doing right here. So this bit right here, this is just boilerplate to print stuff out in JavaScript. We don't have to think about this. The part we have to think about is this one line right here. Now, the other thing you need to know is that fetch will also default to being a GET request. So all we have to do here is run curl and then paste in this URL, because like with fetch, curl also defaults to being a GET request, so we don't need to specify the request we're doing, and because we're just doing a GET request, we don't need to send any data along. So this one right here is just going to get the resource that has an ID of 1. Now, I think you can still change the ID and it will actually work properly. I haven't tested that out. I assume the GET requests work properly, but they might not. They might be set up to just work with this one ID, but in a real REST API, it would work just fine. By the looks of it, it's not working, but I'll cut back to when it's done. Just after I ended the last clip, the request went through. So as you can see, it's gotten the resource that has an ID of 2. So let's go on to the next one. And the next one is just to list out all of the resources. This, once again, is also a GET request. So there's no point testing this one, but because we're here, we might as well. So curl, and then just put in that API endpoint. As you can see, it's going to list out every single resource that's available on this server. Now let's move on to the next one. The next one is a post request. So a post request is typically used for actually creating something on the server. Put is used for updating, but we'll get to put in just a bit. Now this one, it seems like it's going to be a little bit complex to do, but it's actually really straightforward. So what we have to do is curl and then -x. Now -x is just shorthand for doing -- request. And the request method we're setting it to in this case is post. Now we also have to specify the data we want to send. And to do this, I'm going to use the -d option, which is shorthand to do --data. So the way this works is it takes a key value pair, and the separator is an equal sign. So let's just do the same data that's used in here. So what we're going to do is title, spell that correctly, equals, and then foo. And we're also going to do -d again. Body equals bar, and -d again. User ID equals 1. Now we also have this header right here, but we don't actually need it for what we're doing right now. I'll get back to that in just a bit though. So we also have to include the API endpoint that we're using as well. So that is this link right here. Put that on the end and then give that a bit of time to run. I'll cut back to when that is finished. This right here is the problem for relying on online services. It turns out that it's actually just stopped working now. The request does work though, it's just that the server's not working anymore, but we're going to keep powering forward. So the next one we're going to be looking at is how to actually update a resource. So in this case, it's very similar to what we just did. So with that post request we just had before, but what we're going to be doing instead is actually doing a put request. So a put request is used to update something. A post request is used to create something entirely new. Now, this is going to be very similar to what we did before, but instead of doing a post request, pretty much all that changes here is we're now doing a put request instead. The other thing we have to do is also change the API endpoint, because in the post request, what we were doing was making a new post. In this case, we are updating an existing post. So we are updating, in this case, post 1, but we could update post 2, post 3, so on and so forth. So if we run this, assuming the server was working, what it should do is tell us that we've actually gone and updated it. But as we saw before, the server currently isn't working, so let's just go on to the next request. In this case, the next request is a patch request. Now, a patch request is very similar to a put request. The only difference here is that a patch is for a partial update and a put is for basically an entire update. Generally, they just use interchangeably though. So if you're writing a REST API, technically it matters, but as I said, most of the time they're used interchangeably. So all we have to do here is change the request type. We don't even have to change the data that we're sending along. So change this from being a put to being a patch. And the API endpoint also stays the same as well. Now, as for the next request type, we have a delete request. So a delete is a little bit different. It works roughly the same way, but it's just slightly different that we need to change some stuff. So in this case, what we're going to be doing is curl -x to specify the request type. And the request type in this case is delete. So delete, we're going to put in there. And then what we have to do is just copy in this API endpoint. Now, the API endpoint is the same as the one we were just using for put and for post. And this is another reason why REST APIs are so popular, because you can reuse the same URLs and all you have to do is change the method type and you can change what you're going to be doing on them. Now, the rest of the stuff in here is kind of rehashing what we've already gone over. This one right here is just a basic GET request, but instead of just passing along a regular URL, it's passing along one with a query string on it, which works the exact same way we did before. Or this one right here, which is just nested a couple levels deeper. So I don't really think there's any benefit of going over those ones. Now, there is one thing I briefly mentioned earlier, but didn't really elaborate on, and that is headers. So if we have a look at the man page for curl, we can see how that works. So if we go down to --header, and where is that one? This one right here. So this option right here will basically let you pass in some information into your HTTP header. Pretty much as you can see here is you pass it along in a string. So this will very much depend on, I guess, the sort of stuff you're working with. In this case, the example we have here was just passing in a content type. So if you want to do that here, let's just pick an earlier request we saw. So this one right here. All we have to do that changes here, let's go after the end of all of these options. Let's put in the -H option. Now -H is a shortened down version of --header. And all we have to do here is just paste this in and get rid of the extra quote marks because we just need this to be as one big long string. So this will do exactly the same thing as what we're seeing right here. And this isn't the only thing you can use headers for either. Another popular use case for them is for passing in authentication information. Now, this will very much depend on the sort of server you're working with. This one we're working with today, it didn't have any authentication, but Some do. So let's just get rid of this header here and replace it with a different header. Basically, what we're doing here is we're doing basic authentication and then just assume that this right here is some sort of authentication token. So what this is going to do is do a put request, and then in the HTTP header, also put in this information right here, which, assuming we had authentication set up and we had our authentication correct, that would basically let us use the API. Another way you could do this is, instead of doing basic, another common method that exists is doing OAuth authentication. Now, as I said earlier, it's very much going to depend on what the server has implemented for what you actually have to do, so look into the API that you're trying to work with. So I think that's a pretty good rundown of the basic usage of curl to test out a REST API. Now, obviously, there are far more complex things you can do. You can have a massive HTTP header that has a bunch of different things in it, but in this case, what we're doing was some very basic stuff for a very basic API. And in a lot of cases, when you're writing stuff for yourself, that's all you're really going to be doing. Obviously, if you're going to be doing something far more complex, at some point it probably makes sense to switch over to something like Postman. But if it's just something very, very basic, where you're writing a bit of backend code and you want to know, does this actually work? Well, this is a way that you can go about doing that. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, but before I go, I want to thank my patrons. So a special thank you to Joachim, Nathan, Andrew, Gabriel, Peter D, Road, Tony Dono, Kulari, and Zilva. If you want to join the Patreon, there'll be a link to that down below, as well as my Amazon affiliate links where you can buy the gear I use in this channel, or anything else you want and get a small kickback for it. I've also got my podcast, that is Tech Over Tea, available on Library and BitTube, and also this channel, which is available on Library, BitTube, and now also BitChute. So feel free to check out my content on any of those platforms as well. Also, remember to go smash the like button and leave me a comment down below, and remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below as well. I don't know what was going on with this video. This was a massive pain to record. I think this is the longest recording I've done in quite a while. I don't know how it took so long. I just kept stumbling over my words. You'll probably notice if you go back and watch the video how many jump cuts there were. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's because I'm doing this after recording a 3-hour podcast, but for whatever reason, I could not string a sentence together today. So hopefully the video was still good. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.